I watched my mother slip something into my wedding cake, while the photographer captured what should have been the happiest moment of my life. 20 minutes later, as guests rushed me to the hospital with severe poisoning, I made a decision that would expose the criminal empire she'd been hiding for 30 years. The ivory fondant roses on my 3-tier cake looked perfect under the string lights of the Riverside Gardens venue. My mother, Elena Marchetti, stood beside the dessert table in her navy mother-of-the-bride dress, smiling for photos while discreetly crushing something between her fingers. I caught the motion from the corner of my eye as I posed with my new husband, David, but dismissed it as her adjusting a decoration. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The reception had been flawless until that moment. 200 guests filled the garden pavilion, laughter mixing with acoustic guitar as couples swayed on the dance floor. David's best man had just finished his toast, and the evening felt suspended in golden perfection. My dress, a vintage-inspired creation with delicate lace sleeves, caught the breeze as I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes from family and friends who'd traveled from across the country. Elena had insisted on handling the cake-cutting ceremony personally. She'd always been controlling, but I attributed her hover mother tendencies to love. As the photographer positioned us for the traditional shots, she stepped forward with the silver cake server, her movements precise and deliberate. The crowd gathered closer, phones raised to capture the moment. That's when I saw her hand move again. A quick, practiced motion as she leaned over the cake, her body blocking the angle from most guests. Something white and powdery fell from her closed fist onto the slice she was preparing. My stomach dropped, but the crowd was cheering. David was laughing beside me, and the moment moved too fast to process what I'd witnessed. My slice was beautiful. Perfect even. Elena had cut from the bottom tier, where the vanilla sponge met the raspberry filling I'd chosen specifically because it was David's favorite. She placed it on the china plate with ceremony, kissing my cheek as she handed it over. Her lips were cold against my skin. I took the first bite for the cameras. Sweet vanilla and tart berries flooded my mouth, followed immediately by something bitter and medicinal. I forced a smile, chewing slowly, but my tongue had gone numb. The second bite was harder to swallow. The third burned my throat. David noticed first. My hands had started shaking as I set the fork down, and my vision blurred at the edges. The garden lights stretched into streaks of color, and the laughter around me sounded distant and hollow. My mother stood 3 feet away, watching with an expression I'd never seen before. Not concern, calculation. I collapsed during the father-daughter dance. One moment I was swaying with my dad to our song "The Way You Look Tonight," and the next I was on the ground, convulsing as foam spilled from my mouth. The music stopped. Screams erupted from the crowd. David dropped beside me, shouting my name while someone called 911. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. Paramedics worked frantically as they loaded me onto a stretcher, asking rapid-fire questions about allergies and medications while pumping my stomach in the back of the racing vehicle. Through the haze of emergency treatment, I heard one paramedic radio the hospital. Possible poisoning. Unknown substance. Patient is seizing. Elena rode in the ambulance, clutching my hand and crying theatrical tears that looked genuine to everyone except me. I was barely conscious, but I remembered her face when she thought no one was watching. Calm. Almost relieved, as if something she'd been planning had finally happened. The emergency room was chaos. Blood tests, IVs, activated charcoal to counteract whatever was killing me from the inside. Dr. Harrison, the attending physician, worked with quiet efficiency while explaining to David that my symptoms suggested deliberate poisoning with a sophisticated compound. Not accidental. Not food allergy. Intentional. I spent 3 days in intensive care while toxicology reports revealed traces of ricin in my bloodstream. Ricin, a poison so lethal that a single grain can kill an adult. Someone had mixed it into my wedding cake with enough precision to cause severe illness without immediate death. The police were called. Questions were asked. But Elena played the devastated mother perfectly, suggesting that perhaps someone at the catering company had made a terrible mistake. The investigation stalled. No evidence pointed to any specific individual, and the catering staff passed polygraph tests with flying colors. The wedding venue cooperated fully, providing security footage that showed dozens of people near the cake table throughout the evening. Elena's moment of adding something to my slice had been too subtle, too quick, blocked by too many bodies to be clearly captured. But I knew what I'd seen. Recovery took weeks. The ricin had damaged my kidneys and left me with chronic fatigue that made simple tasks exhausting. David took leave from his job as a software engineer to care for me, bringing soup and medication while I lay in bed, replaying that moment over and over. My mother visited daily, bringing flowers and homemade meals, playing the role of devoted caregiver with Academy Award precision. During one of these visits, as Elena fluffed my pillows and adjusted my blankets, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Her purse had fallen open on the bedroom chair, revealing a small glass vial tucked inside a zippered compartment. The label was mostly hidden, but I could make out part of the text. Industrial Chemical Supply, Phoenix, Arizona. Why would my mother, a retired elementary school teacher from suburban Portland, have industrial chemicals in her purse? That night, after she'd gone home and David was asleep beside me, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out who my mother really was. The laptop felt heavy on my weakened legs as I started my research. Elena Marchetti had lived in Portland for 37 years, moving here shortly before I was born. Before that, her history was surprisingly thin. A few scattered records from Arizona, a high school diploma from Phoenix, but nothing substantial. No college transcripts, no employment records, no social media presence beyond the Facebook account she'd created 5 years ago. I dug deeper, using search techniques David had taught me from his cybersecurity work. Elena's social security number led to interesting discoveries. It had been issued in 1987, when she would have been 28 years old. Most people received their numbers as infants or children. Why had my mother waited until adulthood? The Phoenix connection nagged at me. I cross-referenced her name with Arizona newspaper archives, crime databases, and business registrations. What I found made my hands shake worse than the ricin poisoning had. Elena Marchetti appeared in a 1986 Phoenix newspaper article about a federal drug bust. Not as a victim or witness, but as a person of interest who disappeared before arrest warrants could be served. The photo was grainy and 37 years old, but the bone structure was unmistakable. High cheekbones, narrow nose, the same cold eyes that had watched me collapse at my own wedding. According to the article, Elena had been the financial coordinator for a methamphetamine distribution network that stretched across the Southwest. When the DEA closed in, 3 people were arrested and charged with conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. Elena Marchetti and 2 others had vanished, leaving behind fake identities and empty bank accounts. The stolen Social Security number made sense now. My mother hadn't just moved to Oregon, she'd become a different person entirely. I spent hours reading federal case files that had been digitized and made public decades later. The drug operation had been sophisticated, using legitimate businesses as fronts for money laundering and chemical procurement. Elena's role had been crucial. She'd managed the financial networks, coordinated chemical supplies, and maintained the paper trails that kept everyone else protected. Until she betrayed them all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. According to FBI memos I found through Freedom of Information Act requests, Elena had been prepared to testify against her partners in exchange for witness protection when she suddenly disappeared. The prosecution's case collapsed without her testimony, and 2 of the 3 arrested suspects were eventually released on technicalities. But the most chilling discovery came from a supplementary police report buried in the case files. During their investigation, federal agents had found Elena's apartment filled with chemistry textbooks, laboratory equipment, and detailed notes about various toxic compounds. She hadn't just been the accountant for the drug ring, she'd been their poison specialist. The ricin in my wedding cake suddenly made perfect sense. As my strength returned over the following weeks, I continued my investigation with obsessive focus. Elena's new identity in Portland was a masterpiece of deception. She'd established credit, employment history, and social connections with methodical precision. The elementary school teaching job wasn't just a career change. It was the perfect cover for someone who needed to appear harmless and trustworthy. But cracks appeared when I knew where to look. Her house, which I'd visited countless times growing up, contained subtle indicators I'd never noticed. The basement workshop she'd claimed was for gardening projects contained equipment far too sophisticated for growing tomatoes. The locked filing cabinet, she'd said, held old tax documents. The frequent business trips she'd explained as education conferences. My mother hadn't retired from crime when she moved to Oregon. She'd simply gotten better at hiding it. The breakthrough came when I found her real phone. Not the iPhone she carried openly, but an encrypted device hidden inside a hollowed-out cookbook in her kitchen. I'd discovered it during a family dinner while looking for her recipe box, pretending I wanted to surprise her with her famous lasagna. The phone contained messages that revealed the scope of her current operations. Elena Marchetti wasn't just living under a false identity. She was running a chemical supply network that provided exotic poisons to clients across the country. Professional assassins, abusive spouses looking for untraceable methods, criminals who needed to eliminate witnesses without detection. The texts were coded but clear enough to understand. Order confirmations, shipping arrangements, payment processing through cryptocurrency exchanges. My mother had built a digital-age poison empire from our quiet suburban neighborhood. One message thread made my blood run cold. A client discussing a wedding venue in Riverside Gardens, asking about timing and dosage for maximum dramatic effect without immediate fatality. The date stamp was 3 days before my wedding. Elena hadn't poisoned me in a moment of rage or jealousy. She'd been paid to do it. The revelation hit me like physical violence. Someone had hired my own mother to kill me at my wedding reception. Someone who knew our family well enough to make the approach, who understood Elena's background, who wanted me dead but was patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. I screenshot every message, downloaded every file, and transferred the evidence to a secure drive David had helped me set up. The phone went back into its hiding place before Elena returned from her grocery run, but I now had proof of everything. The false identity, the ongoing criminal enterprise, the deliberate poisoning that had nearly killed me in front of everyone I loved. But I still didn't know who had paid her to do it. The answer came from an unexpected source. While organizing our wedding gifts the following week, I found an envelope that had been mixed in with the thank you cards. Heavy cream paper with no return address, containing a single sheet of letterhead from Whitmore & Associates, the law firm handling David's father's estate. The letter was brief and devastating. It informed me that David's inheritance, which included a trust fund worth over $2 million, would transfer to his spouse upon our marriage. But there was a clause I'd never known about. If David died within the first year of marriage, the inheritance would pass directly to his surviving family members, bypassing any spousal claims. David's stepmother, Margaret, had access to estate planning documents. She knew about Elena's background because she'd hired a private investigator to research our family before the wedding. And she had 2 million reasons to want me dead before our first anniversary. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Margaret had approached Elena with a proposition that combined business with personal satisfaction. Elena would earn a substantial fee for eliminating a problem that threatened Margaret's financial security. The wedding venue provided the perfect setting. The rice and dosage had been calculated to cause severe illness that would lead to death within days, making the poisoning look like a delayed reaction to contaminated food. They'd planned my murder like a business transaction. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated my will to survive, and they'd never imagined I'd discover the truth about who my mother really was. Now it was time to decide what to do with that truth. The evidence sat in a manila folder on my kitchen table like a loaded weapon. 3 months of investigation had given me everything I needed to destroy both my mother and Margaret, but I knew that going to the police would only result in lengthy trials and plea bargains that might let them escape real justice. I wanted something more definitive. Something that would ensure they could never hurt anyone else the way they'd tried to hurt me. David found me staring at the folder at 2 in the morning, still wearing the same clothes from the day before. He'd been patient during my recovery, never questioning the long hours I spent on the computer, or the way I'd grown distant and calculating. But that night he sat down across from me and waited for an explanation. I told him everything. The ricin in the wedding cake, Elena's false identity and her criminal past in Phoenix, the poison supply network she'd been running from our suburban neighborhood, Margaret's role in orchestrating the entire plot to collect his inheritance. He listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with each revelation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. "What are you going to do about it?" I could have said we should call the FBI. I could have suggested we gather more evidence and build an airtight case for prosecution. Instead, I told him the truth. I'm going to make them confess publicly, and then I'm going to destroy everything they've built. The plan I'd been developing was elegant in its simplicity. Both Elena and Margaret believed they'd gotten away with attempted murder. They were comfortable, confident, and completely unprepared for someone who understood their methods and motivations better than they understood themselves. Elena's weekly dinner visits continued as if nothing had changed. She'd arrive every Thursday evening with groceries and homemade soup, playing the devoted mother while secretly monitoring my health and waiting for any signs that I suspected her involvement in my poisoning. I let her believe she was succeeding. During one of these visits, I casually mentioned that David and I were planning to renew our vows on our 6-month anniversary. A small ceremony, just family, to celebrate my recovery and reaffirm our commitment after such a traumatic start to our marriage. Elena's eyes lit up with interest that had nothing to do with maternal pride. "That sounds lovely, sweetheart," she said, stirring her homemade minestrone with practiced care. "Where are you thinking of having it?" I'd anticipated this question. "The same venue as our original reception. Riverside Gardens. They're giving us a discount because of what happened there." Elena nodded thoughtfully, already calculating. Another wedding venue. Another opportunity to finish what she'd started. Another payday from Margaret, who would be growing impatient about David's inheritance still being tied up in spousal protections. The next phase required Margaret's participation, and I knew exactly how to get it. David's father had left behind a collection of rare books that Margaret had been trying to sell through private collectors. I convinced David to invite her for dinner to discuss the estate, mentioning casually that we'd also be celebrating my full recovery from the wedding incident. Margaret arrived on a cold February evening wearing her usual armor of pearl jewelry and practiced sympathy. She'd maintained the facade of concerned stepmother throughout my hospitalization, sending flowers and cards while secretly calculating how much longer she'd have to wait for her inheritance windfall. Over dinner, I watched her carefully as David discussed the book collection and estate planning details. She was skilled at hiding her true thoughts, but I'd learned to read the subtle signs during my investigation. The way her fingers tightened on her wine glass when David mentioned updating his will. The slight pause before she expressed concern about my ongoing health issues. The calculating look that flickered across her face when he mentioned our vow renewal ceremony. After she left, I found the listening device she'd planted under our dining room table. A tiny digital recorder, probably placed while I was in the kitchen preparing dessert. Margaret was gathering intelligence for the next attempt, and I was about to give her exactly what she wanted to hear. The following week, I staged a phone conversation with David while Elena was visiting, making sure both women could overhear different parts of the discussion. I talked loudly about new symptoms I'd been experiencing: recurring nausea, dizzy spells, and fatigue that the doctors couldn't explain. I mentioned scheduling additional tests because my physician was concerned about long-term effects from the wedding poisoning. Elena asked casual questions about my symptoms, her tone perfectly calibrated to sound concerned rather than professionally interested. I described everything in detail, watching her mentally catalog the information for her clients who specialized in delayed-effect poisoning methods. Margaret's reaction was more direct. She called David the next day, ostensibly to check on my health, but really to gather intelligence about my condition and prognosis. The listening device captured her side of the conversation, revealing her growing impatience with my continued survival. Both women were taking the bait exactly as I'd hoped. The vow renewal ceremony was scheduled for March 15th, exactly 6 months after our original wedding date. I sent formal invitations to both Elena and Margaret, along with a carefully worded note explaining how important it was to have family present as David and I recommitted ourselves to our marriage and our future together. What they didn't know was that I'd also invited some additional guests. Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, who'd been investigating Elena's poison network based on anonymous tips I'd been providing. Detective Mike Rodriguez from Portland Police, who specialized in domestic violence cases involving exotic toxins. And Dr. Harrison from the hospital, who'd agreed to provide expert testimony about the ricin poisoning and its long-term effects. The ceremony was planned for Saturday evening, but the real event would happen 3 days earlier during Elena's regular Thursday dinner visit. I spent that Wednesday preparing like a general planning a military campaign. Hidden cameras went up in strategic locations throughout the house. Audio recording equipment was concealed in the kitchen and dining room. David's laptop was positioned to live stream everything to a secure server that would preserve the evidence even if our local equipment was damaged or confiscated. I also prepared the bait, a fake medical report, printed on stolen letterhead from my doctor's office, describing my deteriorating condition and estimated survival timeline. The document would be left conspicuously on the kitchen counter where Elena would see it while preparing dinner. Thursday arrived with unexpected spring sunshine that made the whole plan feel somehow blessed. Elena arrived at her usual time carrying grocery bags and wearing the navy cardigan she always wore for our dinner visits. She kissed my cheek and commented on how much better I looked, her practiced concern masking the disappointment in her voice. I'd grown thin during my recovery, which was actually from stress rather than poisoning complications. But Elena didn't need to know that. I let her believe my declining health was progressing according to whatever timeline she and Margaret had calculated. Dinner preparation went exactly as planned. Elena insisted on cooking, taking control of the kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd been adding unwanted ingredients to meals for decades. I excused myself to take a phone call, leaving her alone with the fake medical report positioned perfectly beside the spice rack. From the hallway, I watched through the hidden camera feed as Elena discovered the document. Her reaction was everything I'd hoped for. She photographed each page with her phone, her movements quick and professional. Then she made a call to someone whose voice I recognized from the intercepted messages on her encrypted phone. "The situation is progressing faster than expected," she said quietly, glancing toward the hallway where she thought I was still talking to David's insurance company. "We may need to accelerate the timeline." The response was inaudible from my position, but Elena's next words confirmed everything I needed to know. "Yes, I understand the client is getting impatient. The renewal ceremony could work, but it would require different methods. More immediate results." She ended the call just as I returned to the kitchen, slipping her phone back into her purse with practiced casualness. The rest of dinner proceeded normally, with Elena asking concerned questions about my symptoms and treatment options while mentally planning my second murder attempt. After she left, I reviewed the recording with David. We had everything we needed to prove Elena's ongoing criminal activities and her communication with Margaret about accelerating my death. But I wanted more than just criminal convictions. I wanted public exposure that would ensure their reputations and social connections were destroyed, along with their freedom. The vow renewal ceremony would provide that platform. Friday morning brought an unexpected complication. Margaret called David to express concern about my declining health and suggest postponing the ceremony until I was feeling stronger. Her tone was perfectly calibrated to sound caring, but the subtext was clear. She wanted more time to plan whatever method Elena had suggested for more immediate results. David handled the conversation beautifully, insisting that the ceremony was exactly what I needed to lift my spirits during this difficult time. He mentioned that several family friends would be attending, including some of his colleagues from work and a few people from my old job who'd become concerned about my condition. What he didn't tell Margaret was that those colleagues included Agent Chen, who'd recently joined David's company as a cybersecurity consultant while working undercover on Elena's case. Saturday arrived with the kind of gray Pacific Northwest weather that made indoor celebrations feel cozy and intimate. Riverside Gardens had prepared a smaller version of their main pavilion, decorated with the same white roses and string lights that had witnessed my poisoning 6 months earlier. The guest list was deliberately small, Elena and Margaret, of course, David's two brothers and their wives. A handful of close friends who'd supported us through my recovery. And the 3 law enforcement professionals who'd agreed to attend in plain clothes, ready to document whatever Elena and Margaret might attempt. I wore a simple blue dress instead of a wedding gown, something that would photograph well but wouldn't seem overly formal for the occasion. David looked handsome in his gray suit, though I could see the tension in his shoulders as our guests began arriving. Elena came early to help with preparations, carrying a covered dish that she insisted was my favorite lasagna recipe. I accepted it graciously while noting that she'd brought her large purse, the same one that had contained the industrial chemical vial months earlier. Margaret arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that drew attention to her expensive dress and jewelry. She embraced both David and me with theatrical warmth, commenting loudly about how wonderful it was to see me looking so much healthier. The ceremony itself was brief and genuinely moving. We'd written new vows that focused on surviving challenges together and building a future based on trust and honesty. As we spoke those words, I found myself looking directly at Elena and Margaret, letting them hear the emphasis on truth and justice that would soon define their own futures. After the vows, we moved to the reception area for dinner and toasts. Elena had positioned herself near the drinks table, the same location where she'd had access to my wedding cake 6 months earlier. I watched her carefully as she prepared a champagne toast, noting the subtle hand movements that had become so familiar during my investigation. Margaret was harder to track. She moved through the crowd with practiced social grace, chatting with guests and positioning herself for optimal observation of Elena's activities. Both women were clearly waiting for the right moment to implement whatever plan they'd developed. The moment came during the cake cutting. Unlike our original wedding, this ceremony featured a simple sheet cake from a local bakery, nothing elaborate or expensive, but it provided the same opportunity for Elena to get close to food that David and I would consume in front of witnesses. As the photographer positioned us for the traditional shots, Elena stepped forward with the cake server, just as she had 6 months earlier. Her movements were confident, practiced, and completely oblivious to the multiple cameras now recording every detail of her actions. I saw her hand move toward her purse, saw the quick, subtle motion as she prepared to add something to our cake slices, saw Margaret watching from across the room with barely concealed anticipation, and that's when I made my choice. Instead of allowing Elena to complete her poisoning attempt, I stepped back from the cake table and spoke loudly enough for every guest to hear. "I need to tell you all something important before we cut this cake." The room fell silent. Elena froze with the cake server halfway to the dessert, her face showing the first crack in her composed facade. Margaret's champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. 6 months ago, someone tried to kill me at my wedding reception by putting ricin in my cake. I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the small pavilion. I've spent the last 6 months investigating who did it and why. Elena's face had gone completely white. Margaret set down her champagne glass with a hand that was no longer steady. I discovered that my mother, Elena Marchetti, is not who she claims to be. Her real identity is Elena Vasquez, a federal fugitive who's been running a criminal poison supply network for over 30 years. The gasps from our guests were audible, but I continued without pause. And David's stepmother, Margaret Whitmore, hired my mother to kill me so she could inherit David's trust fund. Elena dropped the cake server. It clattered against the china plate with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Margaret tried to speak, but I wasn't finished. "Agent Chen, Detective Rodriguez, I believe you have enough evidence to make your arrests now." The 2 law enforcement officers stepped forward, badges visible for the first time as they approached Elena and Margaret. Neither woman tried to run. They were too shocked, too completely blindsided by the revelation that their victim had become their hunter. As handcuffs clicked into place, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not anger, not satisfaction, but a deep sense of justice finally being served. The people who tried to erase me from their lives had instead erased themselves from mine. But the real victory wasn't their arrest. It was the fact that I'd refused to let their betrayal define me or destroy the happiness they'd tried so hard to steal. The arrest made national headlines within hours. Mother poisons daughter's wedding cake in insurance scheme dominated news cycles for weeks, but the media attention felt distant and surreal. What mattered more was the immediate aftermath in that pavilion, watching two women who'd shaped my life in such twisted ways finally face consequences for their choices. Elena said nothing as they led her away. No apologies, no explanations, just the cold silence of someone whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled. Margaret, however, couldn't stop talking. She protested her innocence loudly, claiming she'd never heard of Elena's criminal background and had no knowledge of any poisoning plot. Her performance was convincing enough that I almost admired her commitment to the lie. The other guests stood in stunned silence as police vehicles pulled away from Riverside Gardens. David's brothers approached us cautiously, their faces reflecting the shock of learning that their family celebration had been a sting operation. His brother Michael was the first to speak. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. 3 months, I replied. Maybe longer, if I'm honest about the signs I should have seen earlier. Dr. Harrison had stayed behind to provide medical context for the other guests, explaining the effects of ricin poisoning and how miraculous my survival had been. Agent Chen briefed everyone on what would happen next with the investigation and trial preparations. The evening that was supposed to celebrate renewed love had become a crash course in criminal justice. But as the official business concluded and guests began filtering out into the parking lot, something unexpected happened. Instead of leaving quickly to escape the drama, people lingered. They approached David and me with words of support that felt genuine and powerful. "That took incredible courage," said my former colleague Jessica, squeezing my hand. "I can't imagine having the strength to investigate your own mother." David's brother Tom was more direct. "Margaret fooled all of us," he said. "If you hadn't figured this out, she probably would have tried again." The validation felt overwhelming after months of working alone with such dark knowledge. These people understood that exposing Elena and Margaret hadn't been about revenge. It had been about protection. About ensuring that no one else would suffer what I'd endured. The legal proceedings that followed were complex, but ultimately satisfying. Elena's encrypted phone provided evidence of dozens of poison sales to clients across the country, leading to a federal investigation that unraveled her entire network. Her cooperation with prosecutors, motivated by hopes of a reduced sentence, revealed the scope of her criminal enterprise and helped solve several cold cases involving unexplained deaths. Margaret's defense strategy was more sophisticated. Her lawyers argued that she'd been manipulated by Elena, that her inquiries about the inheritance were normal stepmotherly concern, and that any conversations about my health had been taken out of context. But the recorded phone calls and financial records told a different story. Wire transfers from Margaret's accounts to Elena's cryptocurrency wallets, time-stamped communications discussing timing and methods, and her suspicious behavior during my recovery painted a clear picture of conspiracy. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through my investigation and explaining how I'd uncovered the plot against my life. The experience was emotionally exhausting but also liberating. For months, I'd carried this knowledge alone, and finally sharing it with 12 strangers who listened with attention and empathy felt like releasing a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Elena received 25 years in federal prison for her role in the poison network and multiple counts of attempted murder. Her cooperation with investigators earned her a slightly reduced sentence, but she'd be in her 70s before parole eligibility. The elementary school where she'd taught for decades held a special assembly to address the situation with students and parents, many of whom struggled to reconcile the woman they'd known with the criminal she'd been revealed to be. Margaret was sentenced to 15 years for conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. Her defense team had fought hard, but the evidence was overwhelming. During sentencing, she finally abandoned her claims of innocence and offered a tearful apology that felt more calculated than sincere. David's inheritance was placed in a protective trust that she could never access, regardless of what happened to either of us. But the real healing began after the trials ended, when David and I could finally focus on rebuilding our marriage without the shadow of attempted murder hanging over us. The trauma bonding that had developed during my investigation and recovery needed to evolve into something healthier and more sustainable. We started couples therapy with Dr. Martinez, a specialist in trauma recovery, who helped us process what we'd experienced together. The sessions were difficult but necessary. David had been carrying guilt about not protecting me from his stepmother, while I'd been struggling with trust issues that went far beyond my relationship with him. "You survived something that would have destroyed most people," Dr. Martinez told us during one session. "But survival isn't the same as thriving. Now you need to learn how to build a life that isn't defined by what was done to you." That process took time. I'd lost weight during my investigation, developed insomnia that persisted long after the trials ended, and struggled with hypervigilance that made normal social interactions feel dangerous. David had his own challenges, questioning his judgment about people and wrestling with anger toward family members who'd seemed trustworthy. We took a sabbatical from work and spent 3 months traveling together, visiting places that had no connection to Elena, Margaret, or the poisoning incident. We hiked mountains in Colorado, explored art museums in Chicago, and spent lazy weeks on beaches in North Carolina, where the only decisions we had to make were about dinner restaurants and sunset viewing spots. Somewhere during that time, I realized I'd stopped checking over my shoulder constantly, stopped analyzing every meal for signs of tampering, stopped seeing potential threats in every social interaction. The hypervigilance was being replaced by something I'd almost forgotten how to feel: peace. The experience had changed me in ways that went beyond trauma recovery. Investigating Elena's crimes had revealed investigative skills I'd never known I possessed. The methodical research, evidence analysis, and strategic planning had felt natural and engaging in ways my previous career never had. When we returned to Portland, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I enrolled in a criminal justice graduate program with a focus on forensic psychology. If I was going to carry the knowledge of what people were capable of doing to those they claimed to love, I wanted to use that knowledge to help others. The program was challenging but fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected. Case studies that might have seemed academic to other students felt personal and urgent to me. I understood viscerally how it felt to discover that someone you trusted had been planning your death. That perspective made me effective at connecting with victims and understanding the psychological aftermath of violent crimes. My thesis project focused on familial poisoning cases, analyzing patterns in domestic crimes involving exotic toxins. The research revealed disturbing trends about how family relationships could be weaponized, but also highlighted successful intervention strategies and support systems that helped survivors rebuild their lives. Professor Williams, who supervised my research, encouraged me to present my findings at a national conference on domestic violence prevention. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of law enforcement professionals, social workers, and trauma counselors, I felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life before the poisoning incident. "The people closest to us have the greatest opportunity to harm us," I told the audience. "They know our routines, our vulnerabilities, and our trust patterns. But they also underestimate our capacity for resilience and investigation when our survival depends on it." After graduation, I joined the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit as a consultant specializing in domestic poisoning cases. The work was demanding but meaningful, helping investigators understand the psychology behind family-perpetrated crimes and developing profiles that led to arrests in cases that had seemed unsolvable. One case in particular reminded me why this work mattered. A woman in Denver had been experiencing mysterious illnesses after family dinners at her brother-in-law's house. Local police had dismissed her concerns as paranoia, but the pattern she described was identical to what I'd experienced with Elena's careful dosing strategies. Working with Denver investigators, we obtained warrants for toxicology testing and surveillance that revealed her brother-in-law had been slowly poisoning her with antifreeze mixed into homemade soup. His motivation was financial, hoping to inherit property she'd inherited from her parents, but his methods were sophisticated enough that he'd nearly succeeded before she found the courage to report her suspicions. "How did you know to take me seriously?" she asked during a follow-up interview after his arrest. "Because someone tried to kill me the same way," I replied. "And I know what it feels like when people don't believe you." Cases like that validated my decision to turn my trauma into a tool for helping others. Each successful investigation felt like a small victory against the forces that had tried to destroy my own life. David and I renewed our vows again on our 5th wedding anniversary, this time in a small ceremony with just immediate family and close friends. No elaborate reception, no formal dinner, just a simple exchange of promises in our backyard garden surrounded by people who'd supported us through the darkest period of our lives. The vows we wrote that day were different from both our original wedding promises and the words we'd spoken during the sting operation at Riverside Gardens. They acknowledged what we'd survived together while focusing on the future we were building rather than the past we'd overcome. "I promise to trust you with my fears as well as my dreams," I said, looking directly into David's eyes. "I promise to remember that love isn't just about staying together through the good times, but about choosing each other again and again, especially when the world tries to pull us apart." His response made me cry happy tears for the first time in years. "I promise to be worthy of the courage you've shown me. I promise to build a life with you that honors both where we've been and where we're going." We never had children, a decision that felt right for us but sometimes prompted questions from well-meaning relatives. The truth was that the poisoning incident had made us both more cautious about bringing vulnerable lives into our world, and our work with trauma survivors had shown us other ways to contribute to the next generation. Instead, we became foster parents to teenagers aging out of the system, providing temporary stability for kids who needed advocates during their transition to independence. Many of them had survived family betrayals similar to what I'd experienced, and our home became a place where they could process those experiences with people who truly understood. Marcus was 16 when he came to us, having survived years of psychological and financial abuse from relatives who'd been appointed as his guardians after his parents died in a car accident. He'd been stealing small amounts of money to survive, which had led to his placement in foster care. But his real crime had been discovering that his guardians were embezzling from his inheritance. "They made me feel crazy for suspecting them," he told me during one of our late-night kitchen conversations. "Everyone said I should be grateful they took me in." "Gratitude doesn't mean accepting abuse," I replied. "And trusting your instincts doesn't make you ungrateful. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones we need protection from." Marcus lived with us for 2 years before aging out of the system. He's now studying criminal justice at Portland State University, planning a career in financial crimes investigation. We stay in close contact, and he credits our conversations about surviving family betrayal with helping him understand that his experiences weren't his fault. Stories like Marcus's reminded me constantly that my poisoning incident, devastating as it had also been a gift in disguise. It had revealed truths I needed to know, skills I didn't know I had, and a purpose that gave meaning to the trauma. On quiet evenings when David and I sit in our garden watching the sunset over the mountains, I sometimes think about the woman I was before that wedding reception. Trusting, maybe naive, certainly unprepared for the realities of what people were capable of doing to those they claimed to love. That version of myself feels like someone I knew a long time ago, someone I remember fondly but could never return to being. The woman I became after surviving Elena and Margaret's attempt on my life is stronger, more aware, and infinitely more purposeful. I wouldn't choose to repeat the experience, but I also wouldn't trade the person it helped me become. The poisoning that was meant to destroy me instead revealed capabilities I never would have discovered otherwise. The betrayal that was supposed to leave me broken instead taught me the true meaning of resilience. Sometimes people ask if I ever forgive Elena for what she did. The answer is complicated. I don't carry anger toward her anymore, which might be a form of forgiveness. But I also don't maintain any illusion that she was anything other than a dangerous person who made calculated decisions to harm others for personal gain. Margaret is different. Her betrayal felt more personal, because it was rooted in greed rather than criminal expertise. She saw an opportunity to profit from my death, and pursued it with cold calculation. That feels harder to forgive, though I've learned that forgiveness is more about my own peace than about excusing her choices. Both women are serving their sentences in federal facilities hundreds of miles away from Portland. Neither has attempted to contact me, which feels like the best possible outcome. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. The poison network Elena had been running was completely dismantled by federal investigators. Over 40 people were arrested in connection with the case, including manufacturers, distributors, and clients who'd used Elena's services to harm others. The investigation revealed that exotic poisoning was far more common than most people realized, often hidden within family disputes, business partnerships, and romantic relationships. My testimony helped convict 12 of those individuals, and the protocols we developed for investigating suspected poisoning cases have been adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country. It's satisfying to know that the worst experience of my life contributed to preventing similar crimes against other victims. Last month, I received a letter from a woman in Texas whose husband had been slowly poisoning her with arsenic hidden in her coffee creamer. She'd seen news coverage of my case and recognized the pattern of mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't explain. Her courage to report her suspicions, inspired partly by my story, led to his arrest before the dosing could become fatal. "Thank you for showing me that it was possible to fight back," she wrote. "I don't know if I would have found the strength to investigate without your example." Letters like that remind me why I chose to make my story public despite the privacy I could have maintained. Every person who recognizes warning signs, trusts their instincts, or finds the courage to seek help because of something I shared, makes the exposure worthwhile. David and I still live in Portland, though we moved to a different neighborhood after the trials ended. Our new house has better security systems and no connection to either Elena or Margaret, but more importantly, it feels like a place we chose together rather than a location tied to traumatic memories. We host an annual dinner party on the anniversary of my poisoning, not to commemorate the attempt on my life, but to celebrate survival, resilience, and the people who supported us through the aftermath. The guests include law enforcement officers who worked the case, medical professionals who saved my life, and friends who stood by us when our world fell apart. This year's gathering included Marcus and 3 other former foster kids who've become part of our chosen family. Agent Chen brought her husband and twin daughters. Dr. Harrison came with his wife, and Detective Rodriguez attended with his partner. The conversation was lively, warm, and focused on the future rather than the past. As I looked around the table at these people who'd become so important to our lives, I realized that the attempt to poison me had ultimately led to the richest, most meaningful relationships I'd ever experienced. The crisis had stripped away superficial connections and revealed who could be trusted when everything was at stake. That night, after everyone had gone home and David and I were cleaning up the kitchen together, he asked me something he'd never asked before. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if none of this had happened?" I considered the question seriously. Without the poisoning, I probably would have continued in my previous career, maintained a distant but polite relationship with Elena, and remained unaware of Margaret's true nature. I would have been safer but also smaller, living within boundaries I'd never thought to question. "I think I would have been comfortable," I said finally. "But I don't think I would have been truly alive." The woman who'd collapsed at her wedding reception had been reactive, trusting others to define her worth and her place in the world. The woman standing in this kitchen had learned to investigate, to question, to protect herself and others who couldn't protect themselves. The transformation hadn't been comfortable, but it had been necessary. As we finished cleaning and turned off the lights, I felt gratitude for the strange path that had led us here. Not gratitude for the crime itself, but for the strength it had revealed, the purpose it had provided, and the love it had deepened between David and me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to turn trauma into triumph. But tonight, in our secure home surrounded by evidence of the life we'd built together, I felt something I'd never expected to feel again after that wedding reception. I felt safe. Not because the world had become less dangerous, but because I'd become more capable of navigating its dangers. And that felt like the truest form of victory. The media attention from my case eventually faded, but the impact continued to ripple through communities I'd never expected to reach. 3 years after Elena and Margaret's sentencing, I received a phone call that would change everything again. Dr. Rebecca Santos from the Centers for Disease Control called on a Thursday morning while I was reviewing case files in my home office. Her voice carried the careful professional tone I'd learned to recognize from federal investigators. But there was an urgency underneath that made me pay immediate attention. Ms. Chen, we've been tracking a pattern of suspected poisoning cases across 7 states, and your expertise with familial toxin crimes could be crucial to our investigation. The pattern she described was chilling. 12 women had died over the past 18 months from what appeared to be natural causes. But toxicology reviews requested by suspicious family members had revealed traces of exotic compounds in their systems. All 12 had been married to men with significant life insurance policies. All had experienced mysterious illnesses before their deaths. And all had eaten meals prepared by their husbands in the days before they died. We believe we're dealing with a network, Dr. Santos continued. Someone is teaching these methods and possibly supplying materials. My blood went cold. Elena's poison network had been dismantled. But networks could be rebuilt by people who understood the demand and the methods. The CDC investigation became my primary focus for the next 6 months. Working with a joint task force that included FBI behavioral analysts, state police investigators, and forensic toxicologists, we traced the pattern back to an online forum where men discussed relationship problems in coded language that disguised discussions about eliminating unwanted wives. The forum's administrator used the handle Phoenix Rising 87, and linguistic analysis of his posts revealed writing patterns that made my hands shake when I saw the results. Sentence structure, vocabulary choices, and technical knowledge that matched Elena's confiscated communications from her original network. Elena was still in federal prison, but she wasn't working alone. The breakthrough came when we identified one of the forum members preparing to poison his wife in Oklahoma City. Undercover agents made contact with Phoenix Rising 87 Inches to arrange a purchase, and the meeting location led us to a warehouse outside Phoenix operated by Elena's former partner from the original drug ring. Marcus Rivera had been the 3rd member of Elena's organization, the one who'd disappeared when the DEA closed in 37 years ago. While Elena had created a new identity and gone into suburban hiding, Marcus had continued operating in the shadows, building connections with criminal chemists, and developing new distribution methods through dark web marketplaces. When Elena's arrest made national news, Marcus had seen an opportunity. Her case had revealed the demand for exotic poisons among people who wanted to eliminate family members without detection. He'd studied the investigation reports, learned from Elena's mistakes, and built a more sophisticated network that used encrypted communications and cryptocurrency payments to avoid law enforcement detection. The warehouse raid yielded evidence of 12 active poison sales, detailed customer records, and communications revealing the scope of Marcus's operation. But the most disturbing discovery was a folder labeled Marchetti Files, containing detailed analysis of Elena's methods and my investigation techniques. Marcus had been studying my case, learning how I'd uncovered Elena's activities, and developing countermeasures to prevent future victims from following my example. The folder contained psychological profiles of potential victims, strategies for isolating them from support systems, and methods for discrediting anyone who might become suspicious of mysterious illnesses. He'd turned my survival story into a training manual for more effective family murders. The arrest operation was coordinated across 4 states simultaneously. Marcus Rivera was taken into custody at his Phoenix warehouse, while 17 of his clients were arrested in their homes, most of them just days or weeks away from implementing their poisoning plans. The timing probably saved 23 lives, including 12 wives and 11 children who would have been collateral victims. During Marcus's interrogation, he revealed something that changed my understanding of Elena's original attempt on my life. The ricin in my wedding cake hadn't been Margaret's idea. Elena had suggested it as a test case for a new delivery method she was developing for Marcus's network. My poisoning had been both personal revenge and criminal research. Elena had been paid by Margaret, but she'd also been using me as an unwilling test subject for techniques she planned to teach other clients. The revelation felt like being poisoned all over again, not just the physical violation of having toxic substances put in my food, but the psychological violation of being reduced to experimental data in someone else's criminal enterprise. But it also crystallized something important about the work I'd been doing. Every case I solved, every victim I helped, every prevention strategy I developed was a direct response to the people who'd tried to reduce me to a casualty statistic. Marcus Rivera received a life sentence without possibility of parole. His cooperation with investigators helped solve 43 additional poisoning cases and led to the arrest of over 60 people involved in what prosecutors called the most sophisticated domestic murder network in American history. The trial testimony revealed the full scope of what we'd dismantled. Marcus's organization had been responsible for at least 87 deaths over 12 years, most of them women killed by husbands, but also including business partners, elderly relatives, and several children who'd been witnesses to other crimes. Elena's techniques, refined and systematized, had become a blueprint for family annihilation that generated millions of dollars in life insurance payouts while leaving minimal forensic evidence. If I hadn't survived my own poisoning and developed the investigative skills to expose the network, hundreds more people would have died in the coming years. The weight of that knowledge was overwhelming, but it also provided a sense of purpose that sustained me through the difficult months of testimony, media attention, and personal reflection that followed. My book about the experience, The Taste of Betrayal, Surviving Family Murder and Building Justice, became a bestseller that I never intended to write. A literary agent had approached me after the Marcus Rivera case made headlines, suggesting that my story could help other victims recognize warning signs and find the courage to investigate suspicious circumstances in their own families. Writing the book was emotionally exhausting but therapeutically valuable. Organizing my experiences into a coherent narrative helped me understand my own journey from victim to survivor to advocate. The research process also revealed how many other people had survived similar betrayals and rebuilt their lives around helping others. The book tour that followed was unexpectedly healing. In city after city, audience members approached me with their own stories of family betrayal, domestic violence, and survival against impossible odds. Many had never spoken publicly about their experiences, but hearing my story gave them permission to acknowledge their own strength and resilience. A woman in Seattle told me her brother had been slowly poisoning their elderly father to accelerate his inheritance, but she'd been too afraid to report it because no one would believe her. My book had given her the courage to contact Adult Protective Services, leading to an investigation that saved their father's life and resulted in her brother's arrest. A man in Chicago described how his wife had been experiencing mysterious symptoms that doctors couldn't explain. The pattern I described in my book matched what he'd been observing, and medical testing revealed that his wife's sister had been adding prescription medications to her food during family dinners. The sister's motivation was psychological rather than financial, but the intent was equally deadly. Stories like these reinforced my decision to make my experience public, despite the privacy I'd sacrificed. Each person who recognized warning signs or found the courage to seek help validated the choice to transform my trauma into a tool for protecting others. 5 years after my poisoning, David and I received an unexpected invitation. The FBI Academy in Quantico wanted me to develop a training program for agents investigating suspected family poisoning cases. The curriculum would be based on my experience as both victim and investigator, providing law enforcement with insights into the psychology of domestic poisoning and the investigative techniques that had proven most effective. The program, called Intimate Betrayal: Advanced Techniques for Family Poisoning Investigations, became a required course for agents assigned to domestic violence and financial crimes units. Over 3 years, I trained over 400 federal agents and local investigators, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the emotional intelligence necessary to support victims through complex investigations. One of the most rewarding aspects of the training program was working with agents who'd struggled with cases that seemed unsolvable. Detective Maria Gonzalez from Albuquerque had been investigating a series of deaths in elderly care facilities that appeared to be natural causes, but families insisted something suspicious was happening. After attending my training program, Detective Gonzalez returned to New Mexico with new investigative approaches and a deeper understanding of how to interview potential victims who might be too frightened or confused to report their suspicions directly. Within 6 months, she'd uncovered a network of caregivers who were systematically poisoning elderly clients to collect inheritance money from families who trusted them with their most vulnerable relatives. "Your training didn't just teach me new techniques," Detective Gonzalez told me during a follow-up call. It taught me to trust victims' instincts even when their stories seemed impossible. The success of the FBI training program led to similar requests from international law enforcement agencies. I developed modified versions of the curriculum for investigators in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, where family poisoning cases were becoming increasingly sophisticated as criminal networks shared techniques across borders. The international work revealed disturbing patterns in how domestic murder techniques were spreading through online communities and criminal organizations. But it also highlighted the power of survivor testimony to break through cultural barriers and professional skepticism that often prevented effective investigations. Working with investigators around the world reinforced my belief that the trauma I'd experienced had become a force for protection and justice on a scale I never could have imagined while lying in that hospital bed after my wedding reception. David and I celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with a small ceremony at the same garden where we'd held our 5th anniversary vow renewal. But this time, the celebration included representatives from every organization I'd worked with over the previous decade. Agent Chen, now retired from the FBI, attended with her daughters, who were both studying criminal justice in college. Dr. Harrison brought his grandson, who was beginning medical school, with plans to specialize in toxicology. Detective Rodriguez came with his husband and their adopted son, Marcus, our former foster child, who was now working as a financial crimes investigator with the Portland Police Department. The gathering felt like a reunion of people whose lives had been connected by the investigation that started at my wedding reception. But more than that, it felt like a celebration of the community that had grown around our shared commitment to protecting others from the betrayals we'd witnessed or experienced ourselves. During the dinner, Agent Chen proposed a toast that captured everything I felt about the journey we'd all traveled together. 10 years ago, someone tried to poison Sarah at her wedding reception, she said, raising her glass. They thought they were eliminating a problem. Instead, they created a force for justice that has saved hundreds of lives and will continue protecting people for generations to come. As I looked around the table at these people who'd become my chosen family, I realized that the attempt to poison me had ultimately led to the richest, most purposeful life I could have imagined. The crisis had stripped away everything superficial and revealed what truly mattered: the courage to seek truth, the determination to protect others, and the power of turning trauma into triumph. That night, as David and I cleaned up after our guests had gone home, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that evening at Riverside Gardens. The woman who'd collapsed at her wedding reception had been trusting, perhaps naive, and certainly unprepared for the realities of what people were capable of doing to those they claimed to love. The woman standing in this kitchen had learned to investigate, to question, to protect herself and others who couldn't protect themselves. The transformation hadn't been comfortable, but it had been necessary and ultimately life-affirming. My phone rang just as we finished loading the dishwasher. Dr. Santos from the CDC was calling with news about another potential poisoning network that investigators had uncovered in the Pacific Northwest. 3 suspicious deaths, similar patterns, and a request for my expertise in developing the investigation strategy. I know it's late, she said, but we think this could be connected to some of the old Rivera network contacts who weren't captured in the original raids. I looked at David, who nodded with the understanding that had developed between us over years of late-night calls and emergency consultations. This was the work we'd chosen together, the purpose that had grown out of our darkest experience. I'll be there tomorrow morning, I told Dr. Santos. As I hung up the phone, I felt the familiar combination of determination and anticipation that came with each new case. Somewhere in the Northwest, people were in danger from someone they trusted. Someone was planning betrayals that would destroy families and end lives. But they were about to discover that their methods were no longer secret, their techniques were no longer foolproof, and their victims were no longer alone. The poison that was meant to destroy me had instead created a network of protection that spanned the country and continued growing with each case we solved and each life we saved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new investigations, and new opportunities to turn knowledge gained through trauma into tools for justice and protection. But tonight, in our secure home surrounded by evidence of the life and community we'd built together, I felt something profound and sustaining. I felt grateful. not for the crime that had been committed against me, but for the strength it had revealed, the purpose it had provided, and the love it had deepened in every relationship that mattered. The woman who'd survived ricin poisoning at her wedding reception had become someone who could prevent other families from experiencing similar betrayals. The investigation skills I developed to save my own life were now protecting strangers across the country. And that transformation, painful as it had been to achieve, felt like the truest form of victory imaginable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.